The golden light of sunset painted the dusty Wyoming Territory in shades of amber and rose as Clara Bennett struggled with the weight of a full water bucket, her skirts dragging through the dirt of the lonely trail leading back to her family's modest cabin. The year was 1878, and in this unforgiving corner of the West, even the simplest tasks could become trials of endurance. Clara's arms trembled as she paused to catch her breath. At 22, she was no stranger to hard work, but the past week had taken its toll. Her father's fever had worsened, and the twice-daily trips to the creek had become her responsibility alone. Wiping perspiration from her brow with the back of her hand, she looked toward the setting sun and calculated how much daylight remained. Not enough. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her tense. Travelers could mean many things in these parts, and not all of them good. Clara set the bucket down and straightened her back, one hand moving to the small knife hidden in the pocket of her apron. The rider appeared around the bend in the trail, tall in the saddle of a magnificent chestnut stallion. As he drew closer, Clara could make out his features, a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a worn leather hat pulled low over his brow. His duster was coated with the dust of long travel, but the way he carried himself spoke of confidence rather than weariness. "Evening, miss," he called out, slowing his horse to a gentle walk. "Seems you've got quite a burden there." Clara nodded cautiously. "Just water from the creek." "My father needs it." The stranger dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his reins over a nearby branch. "Name's Caleb Thornton," he said, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "Would you allow me to help you with that bucket? Looks mighty heavy for one person." There was something in his eyes, kindness, perhaps, or understanding that made Clara hesitate only briefly before nodding her assent. "I'm Clara Bennett. My father's cabin is just beyond that rise." Caleb smiled, and Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like the turning of a key in a lock she hadn't known existed. He lifted the bucket as if it weighed nothing at all, and Clara noticed the strength in his hands, calloused from work, but gentle in their movements. "Lead the way, Miss Bennett," he said, and Clara found herself walking beside this stranger, this cowboy who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak. As they crested the hill, the small cabin came into view, smoke curling from its chimney against the darkening sky. Clara's younger brother, Daniel, was chopping wood outside, his 12-year-old frame dwarfed by the axe in his hands. "Clara," Daniel called out, dropping the axe and running toward them. He stopped short when he spotted Caleb. "Who's that?" "This is Mr. Thornton," Clara explained. "He's helping me with the water." Daniel eyed Caleb suspiciously before nodding. "Pa's coughing real bad, Clara. The medicine ain't helping much." Clara's heart sank. "Mr. Thornton, I thank you for your assistance. You can set the bucket by the door." Caleb did as instructed but didn't immediately reach for his hat to leave. "Your father's ill?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Pneumonia, we think," Clara replied. "It's been nearly 2 weeks now." Caleb's brow furrowed. "I've some knowledge of herbs and treatments. My mother was a healer of sorts. Perhaps I could take a look." Clara hesitated. Inviting a stranger into their home went against everything her father had taught her about caution in the territories. But Thomas Bennett had been declining rapidly, and the nearest doctor was in Clearwater, a full day's ride away. "Very well," she finally said. "But I'll be watching you closely, Mr. Thornton." Caleb's smile was warm. "I'd expect nothing less, Miss Bennett." Inside the small cabin, Thomas Bennett lay on a narrow bed, his breathing labored and his face flushed with fever. Clara moved to his side immediately, dipping a cloth in cool water and placing it on his forehead. "Pa, this is Mr. Thornton. He's offered to help." Thomas opened his eyes, which were glassy with fever. "You a doctor?" he rasped. "No, sir," Caleb answered honestly, "but I've seen my share of sickness and know a few remedies that might ease your suffering." Thomas studied him for a moment before nodding weakly. "Clara's a good judge of character. If she let you in, you must be decent enough." Caleb removed his duster and rolled up his sleeves. "Miss Bennett, do you have any mullein or wild cherry bark?" Clara shook her head. "We've used the last of our medicinal herbs." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "I've some in my saddlebags, and I'll need hot water and honey if you have it." For the next hour, Caleb worked methodically, brewing a strong-smelling tea from the herbs in his saddlebags and helping Thomas sit up to drink it. He showed Clara how to create a poultice for her father's chest and demonstrated the proper way to thump his back to loosen the congestion in his lungs. As the night deepened, Thomas's breathing eased slightly, and he fell into a more restful sleep than he'd had in days. Clara sank into a chair by the fire, exhaustion washing over her like a tide. "You should rest, Miss Bennett," Caleb said softly. "I can keep watch over your father for a while." Clara looked up at him, this stranger who had walked into their lives and immediately set about making things better. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Thornton?" Caleb sat across from her, his hat resting on his knee. "My father died of lung fever when I was 16. No one should face that alone." In the flickering firelight, Clara saw the shadows of old pain in his eyes and realized there was far more to Caleb Thornton than she had initially thought. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Clearwater," he replied. "I've a job waiting at the Carson Ranch." "That's nearly 20 miles north of here," Caleb nodded. "I'm not expected until the end of the week. I can stay a day or two, help get your father on the mend." Clara wanted to refuse his offer out of pride, but the practical part of her knew she couldn't manage alone. "We can't pay you much." "I'm not asking for payment, Miss Bennett. Just a place to rest my horse and maybe a meal or two." Clara studied him, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but found only sincerity. "Very well, Mr. Thornton. You can sleep in the barn. Daniel will show you where to put your horse." Caleb stood and placed his hat on his head. "Much obliged, Miss Bennett. I'll check on your father once more before I turn in." As he moved back to Thomas's bedside, Clara watched him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. In the territory, kindness was often as rare as rain in August, and she had learned to be cautious of gifts that seemed too generous. Yet something about Caleb Thornton's quiet strength and gentle hands made her want to trust him. That night, as Clara lay in her small bed with Daniel breathing softly beside her, she found herself thinking of the cowboy sleeping in their barn, wondering what twist of fate had brought him to their trail at precisely the moment she needed help. The morning brought a subtle change in Thomas Bennett's condition. His fever had broken sometime in the night, and though he was weak, his breathing was less labored. Clara found Caleb already at work, having fetched fresh water and started a pot of coffee over the fire. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he said, his voice warm. "Your father's doing better. I checked on him at dawn." Clara moved to her father's side and felt his forehead. The burning heat of the previous days had subsided, leaving his skin merely warm. "Thank you," she whispered, not just to Caleb but to whatever Providence had sent him their way. Over the next 3 days, Caleb became an integral part of their small household. He repaired the leaking roof that Clara hadn't been able to fix, chopped enough wood to last a fortnight, and even hunted a deer that provided meat for their table. Each evening, he would sit with Thomas, talking about everything from cattle prices to the changing politics of the territory, giving Clara precious hours to rest or tend to the neglected garden. On the 4th day, as Clara and Caleb worked side by side washing dishes after the midday meal, she found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "What really brings you to these parts, Mr. Thornton? You don't strike me as a man who simply drifts." Caleb's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I've been drifting for 5 years now," he admitted, "but you're right, it wasn't always so." He told her of his family's ranch in Colorado, lost to debt and drought, of his mother's death shortly after, and of his years working cattle drives and odd jobs across the Western territories. "The position at Carson's ranch is the first time I've considered putting down roots since then." Clara listened, hearing as much in what he didn't say as in what he did. There was loneliness in his story, a yearning for connection that mirrored her own. Since her mother had died in childbirth with Daniel, Clara had focused solely on caring for her family, setting aside any dreams of her own. "And you, Miss Bennett, have you always lived in this cabin?" Clara shook her head. "We came from Missouri 6 years ago. Pa had dreams of starting a cattle operation, but the winters here are harsh, and we lost most of our stock the first year. Now he works at the sawmill in Clearwater when he's well, and I take in sewing and washing. Caleb nodded, understanding the unspoken hardships in her simple explanation. It's a beautiful piece of land, though. Good water, good grazing. With the right investment, it could be something. Perhaps, Clara said, though they both knew that investment was just another word for money, something the Bennetts had precious little of. That evening, as Thomas sat up in a chair for the first time in weeks, color returning to his gaunt cheeks, he broached the subject they had all been avoiding. "You'll be leaving soon, I expect," he said to Caleb. "Carson won't hold that job forever." Caleb nodded, his expression unreadable. "Tomorrow, I think. Your health is improving, and I've put things in order as best I can." Clara felt a pang in her chest at his words. In just a few days, Caleb Thornton had become a fixture in their lives, his presence as natural as the sunrise. The thought of him leaving left a hollow feeling in her stomach. "We're mighty grateful for all you've done," Thomas continued. "Aren't we, Clara?" "Yes," she managed, though the word felt inadequate for the debt they owed him. Later that night, unable to sleep, Clara stepped outside to find Caleb sitting on the porch steps, looking up at the star-filled sky. Without a word, she sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body but not so close as to be improper. "I've been thinking," Caleb said after a long moment of companionable silence. "Carson's ranch isn't far. I could ride back this way from time to time, check on you all." Clara's heart quickened. "We would welcome your company, Mr. Thornton." "Caleb," he corrected gently. "After all we've shared these past days, I think we can dispense with formalities, don't you?" Clara smiled, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "Caleb, then." Their eyes met in the moonlight, and Clara saw in his gaze a reflection of her own longing for connection, for understanding, for something more than the mere survival that had defined her existence for so long. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean closer, might bridge the gap between them with more than words, but Caleb was a gentleman and the moment passed. "I should get some rest," he said, rising to his feet. "Dawn comes early." "Yes," Clara agreed, trying to hide her disappointment. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Clara." As she watched him walk toward the barn, Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of the chill in the night air, or perhaps it was the chill of anticipating his absence. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a crispness that hinted at the approaching autumn. Caleb had his horse saddled and ready by the time Clara emerged from the cabin, a package wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. "I've left instructions for your father's medicine," he said, handing her the package. "There's enough herbs here to last a month, by which time he should be fully recovered." "Thank you," Clara said, holding the package close as if it were a precious gift, which in many ways it was. For everything, Thomas and Daniel came out to bid him farewell, Thomas still moving slowly but standing straighter than he had in weeks. "You're welcome at our table anytime, son," Thomas said, extending his hand. Caleb shook it firmly. "I'll hold you to that, sir." As he mounted his horse, Caleb looked down at Clara, his eyes lingering on her face as if committing it to memory. "I'll be back," he promised. "In 2 weeks' time, if that's acceptable." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. With a tip of his hat and a final smile that seemed reserved just for her, Caleb turned his horse northward and rode away, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the morning stillness. Clara stood watching long after he had disappeared from view, the package of herbs clutched to her chest, and a strange mixture of hope and longing unfurling within her heart. True to his word, Caleb returned exactly 2 weeks later, arriving just as Clara was preparing the evening meal. His appearance at their door sent Daniel running to greet him and brought a smile to Thomas's face that Clara hadn't seen in years. Over supper, Caleb spoke of his work at the Carson ranch, the men he'd met, and the challenges of breaking new horses for the upcoming cattle drive. Clara found herself hanging on his every word, imagining the world beyond their small homestead through his vivid descriptions. After the meal, as Thomas and Daniel settled in for a game of checkers, Caleb invited Clara for a walk, ostensibly to show her a patch of wild herbs he'd spotted on his ride-in. Under the canopy of early stars, they walked side by side, close but not touching, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. Caleb spoke of his dreams for the future, a place of his own someday, land that couldn't be taken away, and Clara shared stories of her childhood in Missouri, memories she rarely allowed herself to revisit. As they circled back toward the cabin, Caleb paused, turning to face her. "I've thought of you every day since I left," he admitted, his voice low and earnest, Clara's breath caught in her throat. "I've thought of you too," she confessed, the words barely audible even to her own ears. Caleb took a step closer, his eyes searching hers for permission. When she didn't pull away, he reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Clara Bennett, you've bewitched me completely." And then he was kissing her, softly at first, a question more than a demand. Clara answered by leaning into him, her hands finding their way to his shoulders as his arms encircled her waist. The world seemed to still around them, the only reality the warmth of his lips on hers, and the thundering of her heart against her ribs. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that the moment I first saw you struggling with that water bucket," he murmured. Clara laughed softly. "My father would have shot you on the spot." "A risk I would gladly have taken," Caleb replied, his smile visible even in the gathering darkness. That night marked the beginning of a courtship conducted primarily through letters and brief, precious visits whenever Caleb could ride the 20 miles from Carson's ranch. Thomas, seeing the light that had returned to his daughter's eyes, gave his blessing with minimal grumbling about cowboys with wandering feet. As summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to the first bitter winds of winter, Caleb's visits became the focal points around which Clara organized her existence. She found herself counting days, then hours, until she would see him again, savoring each moment of his presence and revisiting their conversations in the quiet hours of night. In November, with snow already blanketing the higher elevations, Caleb arrived with news that would change everything. "Carson's offered me a permanent position," he told Clara as they sat before the fire, their hands intertwined. "Foreman of the North Range with a cabin of my own and a stake in next year's calves." Clara's heart sank even as she smiled for him. "That's wonderful, Caleb, you deserve it." "There's more," he continued, turning to face her fully. "The cabin's big enough for a family, Clara. Carson even mentioned that his wife could use help with the household accounts, said a woman with your education would be a blessing." Clara stared at him, scarcely daring to understand his meaning. "What are you saying?" Caleb reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object that glinted in the firelight, a simple gold band with a single tiny pearl set into its surface. "I'm saying I love you, Clara Bennett. I'm saying I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as Caleb slid from his chair to one knee before her. "Will you marry me, Clara? Will you be my wife and partner in whatever adventures lie ahead?" For a moment, Clara couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the emotions flooding through her. 6 months ago, she had been a young woman with responsibilities but few prospects, her dreams as dusty and forgotten as old photographs. Now, this man, this wonderful, kind, strong man, was offering her not just his heart but a future brighter than any she had dared to imagine. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes, Caleb Thornton, I will marry you." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, but neither of them cared as he rose to his feet, drawing her up with him and into an embrace that felt like coming home. The weeks that followed were a flurry of preparation. The wedding was set for Christmas Day, a time when work at the ranch would be slower and travel still possible before the worst of winter's storms. Clara sewed her wedding dress by lamplight, adapting her mother's lace-trimmed Sunday best into a creation that brought tears to Thomas's eyes when he first saw it completed. Caleb, meanwhile, threw himself into preparing their future home, adding a second room to the cabin Carson had provided and filling it with simple but sturdy furniture crafted by his own hands. Each letter he sent detailed some new improvement: curtains purchased from the mercantile, a rocking chair for the porch, a bookshelf for Clara's small but cherished collection of novels. On December 23rd, 2 days before the wedding, disaster struck. A fierce blizzard descended on the territory, blocking mountain passes and turning the trail between the Bennett homestead and Carson's ranch into an impassable drift of snow and ice. By Christmas Eve morning, with no sign of the storm abating, Clara stood at the window of the cabin, watching the whirling white landscape with a heart growing heavier by the hour. "He won't make it," she said softly to her father, who had been pretending to read the same page of his Bible for the past hour. "Not in this weather." Thomas set the Bible aside and came to stand beside her. "Caleb Thornton is the most determined man I've ever met, Clara. If there's a way through, he'll find it." But as darkness fell on Christmas Eve, with no sign of Caleb and the storm howling like a wounded beast around the cabin's walls, even Thomas's reassurances began to ring hollow. Clara moved through the evening rituals mechanically, preparing a simple supper, helping Daniel hang his stocking by the fireplace, banking the fire for the night, all while fighting back tears of disappointment and worry. What if Caleb had tried to come despite the storm? What if he was out there somewhere, lost in the blinding white, or, worse, injured and alone? Sleep eluded her that night. Every creak of the cabin's timbers under the weight of snow, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, had her sitting up, listening for hoofbeats that never came. By dawn, Clara had resigned herself to the reality that there would be no wedding that day. She tucked her dress away in the trunk at the foot of her bed, refusing to let Daniel or her father see the depth of her heartbreak. Christmas Day passed in a blur of forced cheer and hollow celebrations. Thomas and Daniel did their best to lift her spirits, presenting her with small, thoughtful gifts and keeping conversation deliberately light. Clara appreciated their efforts, but by evening, as she stood once more at the window watching the still falling snow, she felt a weariness that went beyond the physical. "He's alive, Clara," Thomas said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I feel it in my bones." "The storm caught him at Carson's, that's all. He's too smart to risk the journey in this weather." Clara nodded, knowing her father was right but unable to shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over her. "I know, Pa, I miss him." Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently. "That's what love is, daughter. Missing someone so much it hurts, even when they've only been gone a day." 3 more days passed with no word from Caleb and no break in the storm. Clara tried to keep busy, to focus on the daily tasks that had always grounded her, but her mind constantly wandered to Caleb. Was he thinking of her? Was he as devastated by their separation as she was? On the 4th day, the storm finally began to ease, the howling winds diminishing to occasional gusts and the snowfall thinning to gentle flurries. Clara stood on the porch, wrapped in her warmest shawl, and breathed in the crisp, clean air, allowing herself to hope once more. By midday, the sky had cleared completely, revealing a world transformed into a glistening white wonderland. The snow lay deep on the ground, but the sun shone brilliantly, beginning the slow process of melting that would eventually make the trails passable again. It was Daniel who spotted the rider first, a dark figure moving slowly through the snow-covered landscape, leading his horse rather than riding it. He shouted from where he'd been clearing a path to the barn, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "Clara, someone's coming." Clara's heart leapt to her throat as she rushed to the edge of the porch, shading her eyes against the sun's glare on the snow. The figure was still too distant to identify, but something in the way he moved, in the set of his shoulders, made her pulse quicken. "Caleb," she whispered, and then she was moving, heedless of the deep snow that soaked her skirts and the cold that bit at her exposed skin. She waded through drifts that reached almost to her knees, driven forward by a need more powerful than caution or comfort. As the distance between them decreased, she could see that it was indeed Caleb, his face reddened by cold and his clothes crusted with ice and snow. He was leading his exhausted horse, which was laden with what appeared to be supplies strapped to its saddle. When he saw her coming, Caleb stopped, his face breaking into a smile of such pure joy that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. She pushed forward with renewed determination, and then he was dropping the reins and moving toward her, his long strides eating up the distance until they collided in a tangle of arms and breathless laughter. "You came," Clara gasped as Caleb lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle that sent snow flying around them, You actually came. Wild horses couldn't have kept me away, Caleb replied, setting her down but keeping his arms locked around her. Though I admit, this blizzard gave it a fair try. Clara pulled back just enough to see his face clearly, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the chapped condition of his lips. You rode through the storm. Caleb, you could have been killed. I started out before the worst of it hit, he explained. Made it about halfway before I had to take shelter in an abandoned line shack. Been waiting it out there, going half mad with worry about you and counting the hours until I could get through. Clara touched his cheek, feeling the cold of his skin beneath her fingertips. You're freezing. Come inside before you catch your death. Caleb caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. Not yet. There's something I need to do first. He glanced over her shoulder to where Thomas and Daniel stood watching from the porch, with your father's permission, of course. Thomas's laugh carried across the snow-covered yard. I think we're well past permissions, son. Do what you came to do. With a grin, Caleb turned back to Clara and dropped to one knee in the snow. From inside his coat, he produced a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, which he unwrapped to reveal a delicate silver chain with a heart-shaped locket dangling from it. It's not Christmas anymore, he said, and we've missed our wedding day. But Clara Bennett, I love you more today than I did when I asked you to be my wife, and I'll love you even more tomorrow. So I'm asking again, will you marry me? Not someday, not when the weather clears or when it's convenient, but now, today. Clara's eyes widened. Today, but how? I brought a preacher with me, Caleb said, gesturing toward his horse. Well, not exactly a preacher, but Judge Wilson from Clearwater. He was visiting Carson's ranch when the storm hit, and when he heard our situation, he volunteered to come perform the ceremony. He's waiting at the line shack with a couple of Carson's men who helped us break trail. Clara stared at him in disbelief, then looked back at her father, who was grinning broadly. You knew about this, Thomas shrugged. Caleb managed to get a message to us yesterday with one of Carson's men who lives closer, said to have you ready by noon today. Clara turned back to Caleb, who was still kneeling in the snow, the locket gleaming in his outstretched hand. So, Clara Bennett, what do you say? Will you marry me today in your father's cabin, with the sun shining on the snow and our future stretching out before us? Clara felt a bubble of laughter rise in her throat, pure joy spilling over into sound. Yes, she said, pulling him to his feet. Yes, Caleb Thornton, I will marry you today and every day for the rest of our lives. The wedding, hastily arranged but no less meaningful for its simplicity, took place that afternoon in the Bennett cabin. Clara wore her carefully sewn dress, and Caleb had somehow managed to bring a new suit, only slightly rumpled from its journey in his saddlebags. Judge Wilson, a portly man with kind eyes and a booming voice, performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, while Thomas, Daniel, and the two ranch hands from Carson's served as witnesses. As Clara and Caleb exchanged their vows, the late afternoon sun streamed through the cabin's windows, casting a golden glow over the proceedings that felt like a blessing from above. When Judge Wilson pronounced them husband and wife, and Caleb bent to kiss his bride, Clara felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The small celebration that followed was humble but joyous. One of Carson's men produced a fiddle from his saddlebag, and soon the cabin was filled with music and laughter. Clara and Caleb danced their first dance as husband and wife on the cleared floor of the main room, their bodies close and their eyes never leaving each other's faces. I can't believe you did all this, Clara murmured as they swayed to a slow waltz. Risked the storm, brought the judge, arranged everything. Caleb's hand tightened at her waist. For you, Clara, I would move mountains. A little snow is nothing in comparison. As night fell, the guests departed for the line shack where they would spend the night before returning to Carson's ranch the next day. Thomas and Daniel, with elaborate casualness, announced that they would be sleeping in the barn, giving the newlyweds privacy in the cabin, a gesture that brought a blush to Clara's cheeks, but a grateful smile to Caleb's lips. Alone at last, Caleb built up the fire while Clara prepared a simple supper from the stores in the pantry. They ate by firelight, sitting close on the small sofa, their conversation interspersed with touches and glances that spoke of the night to come. After the dishes were cleared away, Caleb took Clara's hand and led her to the center of the room. From his pocket, he produced the silver locket he had shown her earlier. "I meant to give you this properly," he said, opening it to reveal tiny portraits, one of Clara, painted from a photograph she had sent him, and one of Caleb, both rendered in delicate miniature by an artist in Clearwater. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered as Caleb fastened the chain around her neck. The locket rested just above her heart, cool against her skin. "Not half as beautiful as you," Caleb replied, his voice dropping to a husky whisper. His hands moved to cup her face, thumbs gently tracing the curve of her cheekbones. "My wife," he breathed, wonder evident in his tone. "My husband," Clara answered, lifting her face to his. Their kiss was different from those they had shared before, deeper, unhurried, filled with the knowledge that they had all night, all their lives, to explore each other. Clara's hands slid up Caleb's chest to twine around his neck, while his arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer until not even air could pass between their bodies. When they finally separated, both breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Clara Thornton," he said, testing the sound of her new name. Clara smiled, feeling a thrill at hearing herself addressed so. "And I love you, Caleb Thornton, now and always." Later, as they lay entwined beneath the quilts of Clara's bed, the fire burning low in the hearth and moonlight spilling through the window to paint silver patterns across the floor, Caleb told her of his plans for their future. "Carson's offered me a partnership," he said, his fingers tracing idle patterns on the bare skin of her shoulder. "Not just a foreman's position, but a true stake in the operation. With my savings and his backing, we could start building our own herd next spring." Clara propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at her husband's face in the dim light. "A partnership, Caleb, that's wonderful," he nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It is. But there's something else I've been considering." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "Your father's land has potential, Clara. With the right investment, it could be a fine ranch, and it's your home, the place you love." Clara's breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting. "You'd consider staying here, taking over Pa's homestead." "If that's what you want," Caleb said simply. "Carson's offer is generous, but building something of our own, something that could be passed down to our children someday, that has its own appeal." The mention of children sent a warm flush through Clara's body. "Our children," she echoed softly. Caleb's hand moved to rest against her still flat stomach, his touch reverent. "Our family," he corrected, pulling her down for a kiss that spoke of dreams and possibilities and a future bright with promise. The decision to stay and develop the Bennett homestead was made over the following weeks, as winter's grip on the land gradually loosened. Thomas, whose health had continued to improve since Caleb's first arrival the previous summer, was initially resistant to the idea of accepting help. But the prospect of seeing his land transformed into the ranch he had always envisioned eventually won him over. With a loan secured against Caleb's savings and Carson's backing, spring brought a flurry of activity to the Bennett, now Thornton, property. Fences were mended and extended, new outbuildings constructed, and a small herd of quality breeding stock purchased at auction in Clearwater. Clara watched with pride as Caleb threw himself into the work, his natural leadership drawing respect from the hired hands and his innovative ideas transforming the modest homestead into a promising operation. She found her own role evolving as well, no longer just maintaining a household but actively participating in the business aspects of the ranch, her education proving valuable as she kept the books and corresponded with suppliers and buyers. By summer's end, the transformation was remarkable. The cabin had been expanded to include a proper kitchen and a second bedroom. The barn had been rebuilt and enlarged to accommodate more horses and equipment. And the first calves born on Thornton land grazed in the lush pastures where once only a few scrawny steers had picked at sparse grass. On the anniversary of the day, Caleb had first found Clara struggling with her water bucket. They hosted a celebration for friends and neighbors, a gathering that served both as a housewarming for their improved home and as an announcement of Clara's pregnancy, confirmed by the doctor in Clearwater just a week earlier. As the sun set on their guests' departing wagons, Caleb and Clara stood on the porch of their home, his arm around her waist and her head resting against his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Clara looked out over the land that had once seemed a burden, but now represented possibility and prosperity. She thought of the child growing beneath her heart, of Daniel thriving under Caleb's guidance, of her father's renewed vigor as he took on the role of advisor and storyteller to the ranch hands. "More than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "And you?" Caleb turned her in his arms, one hand coming to rest protectively over the slight swell of her stomach. "I found everything I ever wanted the day I saw you carrying that water bucket," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Everything since has just been confirmation that some things are meant to be." Clara rose on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. As they stood wrapped in each other's arms, with the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above them and the sounds of their thriving ranch around them, she knew with absolute certainty that their story, which had begun with a chance meeting on a dusty trail, would continue to unfold in ways even more beautiful and unexpected than its beginning. In the years that followed, the Thornton Ranch grew to become one of the most respected operations in the territory. Clara and Caleb welcomed 3 twin girls, Catherine and Cecilia, born the following spring, and a son, Charles Thomas, who arrived 2 years later. The expanded family filled their home with laughter, learning, and love. Thomas Bennett lived to see his grandchildren take their first steps on the land he had claimed, but never fully tamed, finding in his golden years the peace and prosperity that had eluded him in his youth. Daniel, under Caleb's mentorship, developed into a skilled rancher in his own right, eventually managing a section of the property and later starting his own adjacent operation. Through droughts and harsh winters, through cattle fever and market fluctuations, through all the challenges that came with carving a life from the untamed West, Clara and Caleb faced each obstacle together, their partnership strengthening with every trial overcome. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Caleb would take Clara's hand and lead her to the creek where he had first found her struggling with that water bucket. There, under the vast Wyoming sky, they would sit side by side, marveling at how a simple act of kindness had set in motion a love story that continued to write itself with each passing day. "I thank God for your stubborn independence," Caleb would often tease, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "If you hadn't insisted on fetching that water yourself, I might have ridden right past your trail." And Clara would lean against his shoulder, her fingers intertwined with his, and say, "And I thank God you were the kind of man who would stop to help a stranger."